Hello everyone, I'm Emma. I work for CEM. I'm the head of marketing at CEM. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. So good morning, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. We are really happy that you are able to join us today, especially as some of you will probably be on holiday as well. So thank you so much for taking the time out to join us. Today we're going to be talking about letting no student fall behind and understanding how CEM's baseline assessments, as an example, can aid recovery from COVID-19. Just a piece of housekeeping before we get started. You should get a follow-up after the webinar, so we'll remind you of that as we get to the end of this session today. You are in listen-only mode though, so if you have any questions, do put them in the question section or the chat, and we'll moderate those throughout the session. There'll also be a poll through the session as well, so be ready for that, because we'd really like to get your opinions. No opinions are silly. We're really interested in hearing your experiences and your ideas as well. Okay, so just to give you a little bit of background about CEM, we've been working with schools for over 30 years. We currently work in about 98 countries. We're known for our evidence-based approach to formative assessments. We work with schools in the UK and abroad. We work with ministries, we work with associations, etc. We used to be part of the University of Durham, but in 2019 we became part of the University of Cambridge, which was a really exciting event for us, and just means that we can help fulfill our mission even more than we've done before. So we do believe in evidence, and we know that excellent teachers can use evidence to transform that learning, and we can help turn data into knowledge. And we know that at the moment that is going to be more important than ever, because you can't do everything. We can't catch up on everything we've done. So the session today is really going to look at how we can help you support smart decision making and able to focus what you're doing and what you're teaching in the classroom. Okay, so I'm really lucky to be joined today by the Director of Policy for CEM, Kate Bailey. And Kate has been working for CEM for quite some time. She's been in education for a really long time. She has research interests in this area, so she knows her stuff, and she's a really great person to work with. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Kate.
Good morning, everybody. Hello, wherever you are in the world. So I'm going to start off just summarising where I think we are with this situation. So, and by the way, I don't think there can be a group of people who have worked harder and been more impacted by this when it comes to looking after our young people. Well done to all of you for all the work that you have put in over the recent months. So the COVID-19 crisis has caused school closures in 188 countries. There's not many countries that haven't been impacted. 1.7 billion children and their families and young people have been disrupted. This is almost unprecedented in those countries. So we're not only facing potential learning loss for those students, but also an impact on their aspirations for the future and on their engagement with school. And these factors, we are concerned, will have the potential to have a long-term impact on those children's educational futures. So when we think about impact, we can think about it in two ways. There's a potential impact on learning. This is about how much those students have learned compared to how much they would have learned were they in the classroom. Not all students will have experienced quality education when they are based at home. And this depends largely on the educational continuity solutions that have been put in place in different schools and countries around the world. So how well have the distance learning tools been implemented? How experienced are you as a profession of teaching online? It doesn't come easily. I know talking to an audience in a big room is a very different experience to what I'm doing now, delivering a webinar. The feedback you get is different, the cues that you get from your class would be different, and although you can work as hard as you want, you won't get the same type of experience as you would having those children in the classroom there with you. Many governments now, according to the OECD, are trying to understand the impact of how learning has been carried on online, how well it's been done in different countries, what's worked, what's not worked, so that we can build resilience into the system for the future. I've been involved in a couple of sessions with some governments from developing countries, and they have been incredibly ingenious in the way they've continued to deliver educational input to their students. So I was on a call a little while ago where some caravans have been kitted out with classroom resources, with information, with laptops and mobile connectivity, and driven out into the desert to work with desert communities. It's truly amazing, and it's brought out the best in people. Despite that, there is going to be an impact on how much those students have learned. We're certainly learning a lot, I guess. So then there's also an impact on student engagement. So this isn't about how much the students have learned. This is about how many students have learned in the time over lockdown. So we would imagine, and the kind of the hypothesis is that engaging with online learning for the already maybe slightly disaffected students will increase their disaffection and their disengagement from school. So early results suggest that between 5 to 8% of French students were not able to be reached and in contact with their teachers 2 weeks after lockdown. Higher percentage in Los Angeles, 13% of high school students ceased to engage with their teaching staff after 3 weeks into lockdown. So what has the impact on them been? Not just about the lost learning, but about the engagement with school. So there's a risk there, a really high risk of long-term disengagement and dropout of those students. Here's a question for you just to get us engaged. What's your experience? What has your experience been of the level of learning? How do you think that has been compared to normal, normal school experiences? And what about the level of disengagement? Have you seen that? I think many of you will be calling in from international schools. I guess that might be different from kind of some state-funded schools. Do share those experiences with us, and Emma and the team are going to be monitoring your questions and comments so that we can perhaps bring those into questions and comments later in the webinar. Thinking about the impact that might have on the system and on our students, we can think of it like this. Bit of a matrix here. I do like a matrix. Up the left-hand side, we've got the intensity of learning. So how effective has the learning been that's been delivered online? And then along the bottom, we've got the number of students learning. So where we've got really lots and lots of students learning, but we might have, and we've got high engagement, so low amounts of learning. So there's not a lot of learning going on, but the students are engaged with they're engaged with their teachers, they're joining in the sessions, they're reporting in to say that they're there and they're returning some work. Even though the learning might not be so impactful, there will be an impact, but it's likely to be short term because those students are engaged. So there'll be a blip, but the students will be there, ready and engaged and ready to start back when schools return. The most likely to be impact are the ones where teachers are well prepared, there's lots of learning going on, but the numbers of students aren't there, they aren't engaging for whatever reason. Those are the students that we're likely to see have more of a long-term learning loss and a long-term impact from their experiences over COVID. So just give us a bit of thought. Who are the students who are always there, always present, always signing in? Who are the ones that you haven't seen? And how does that relate to the amount that they're learning? So what do we expect to see when schools come back? So we are expecting an erosion of basic skills, and that is down to practice. So these are skills that you wouldn't necessarily be teaching, like writing, like basic arithmetic, but they would be practicing those through all of the different curriculum subjects that they would be doing in normal school. We'll also obviously experience a loss of curriculum knowledge. That's harder to measure though because of the different curricula that there are around the world, the different order in which they're taught. some students are going to have difficulty re-engaging with school, especially those where they might have found school to be an anxious place to be. The extended period away is likely to increase their worries, their concerns about returning to school in person. And as they find it difficult to re-engage, they'll become easily demotivated as they fall farther behind, which will result in a limiting of their educational aspirations. They may have been limited anyway. This could further exacerbate that. And of course, many of students, even the best learners and the most engaged, may have suffered personal losses over COVID, which will impact their mental well-being. So how can we help recover? I obviously, talking from CEM and Cambridge, we can't give a panacea, we can't give a single solution that's going to help all of those problems, but I'm going to talk to you about how I think we can help you in this situation. I think the most important thing, and you will, if you look at the OECD guidance, government guidance, it's about get an assessment of what students know and how much they've been impacted as soon as you possibly can. Use a high quality baseline assessment where you can, because that gives you some data that you can be very, you can really trust. It's reliable, it's been tested. You know, these assessments have been trialed in the field over many years, so you can be sure that you're getting the best picture of what children know and can do. And gather information as well from your teaching staff, from your colleagues, about who has attended, who's been present, who's returned work, who in your class has been the ones who've been the least engaged. That's so you've got all of the information you can to plan carefully for what's coming through the rest of the school year. You've got all of that data together, and now analyse it. Don't sit on your own at home and work through this. Get a team of colleagues together, work with your heads of department, work with your year group colleagues. Think about which groups of students are most impacted. Some of the reports I'm going to talk you through in a couple of minutes will help you understand where those groups might be. How might that potentially impact on student outcomes? So in secondary, you might have students going into GCSEs this year, next year, IB, A levels. How is the COVID situation likely to impact on what they're going to achieve? Identify groups and clusters of schools so that you can put into place learning plans that help them, and identify the most at the risk of being disengaged. And then we're going to act. So what are we going to do with that information? We've got an assessment, we've got some analysis of that data. What can we now do to put the right plans into place to support those learners? So introducing personalised plans for learners based on their disengagement levels, based on what they've learned. Focus on what needs to be learned. Any of you who've looked at the information that John Hattie has put out there about the experience after the New Zealand earthquake in 2011 will have focused on that little nugget of information, which was actually in New Zealand, it didn't impact on later outcomes for those learners. Because what it did was when schools returned, it really focused the teachers on what needed to be learned, not covering the whole curriculum, but what are the really important things that the students needed to know to be successful in those exams. And it looks like what that did was it actually raised the level of attainment in some areas. They certainly saw no loss, they actually saw some small gains. And focus on engaging all of the students. And think of ways to encourage them back into the classroom warmly, get them started, think of things that are going to make them feel happy and engaged about coming back, and not over focusing on the worries that they might have about the learning that they may have lost. Okay, I'm just going to go into a bit more detail now then about assessment. That's where our expertise is in CEM. That's where all of our history and our pedigree is built around providing really high quality assessment. So what we're looking at here is gathering data on skills and aptitudes. So it's going to be very difficult to gather data across populations, across countries on curriculum learning, for the very reason I gave earlier, that people are following different curricula. In a school, they might even be at different points in that curricula. But what we are expecting to see is an erosion of those basic skills and aptitudes that students need to be successful across the whole curriculum. So the assessment that we provide is a computer adaptive assessment that really accurately pinpoints skills and aptitudes. Computer adaptive nature of it means that it is as good at assessing the lower ability students as it is the higher ability students. So a student going into our assessment at the age of, let's say, 12, if they are of a lower ability level, the computer will adapt the questions that are delivered to them down to the level of probably a 7-year-old to make sure that students of every ability age were able to get a really good pinpointed measure for them. And the same with the most gifted students, most able students. The assessment goes on to challenge them with really difficult questions. But despite that, despite having thousands and thousands of items in that item bank waiting to be selected for the students, the assessment fits into a single lesson period. It takes about 45, 50 minutes, and you can assess all the students at once at computers. There's no teacher marking, there's very little you need to do, and the reports are available almost immediately so that you can start using that information straight away. And then, as I mentioned, let's look at collating some attendance data. What are the levels of absenteeism, how many students were engaged with their distance learning, and how many tasks were completed and returned. Okay, I'm going to give you a bit more information on our baseline assessment now. So as I mentioned, this puts critical information that you need about those skills that may have been eroded, and it gets that information to you early. You don't have to do a load of tasks and kind of an assessment yourself over what might be weeks. We can get this for you in 45 minutes. This provides you with actionable information on skills and aptitudes. So which has been most affected? Is it their vocabulary that has reduced? Is it their mathematics skills that have reduced? Is it their reading? And it can help you to identify learning gaps. It also provides a really useful, reliable, robust way of starting to measure later progress. So for those of you who might be new to this, measuring now, taking a measurement now when schools go back, you can then follow up a year later and you should be able to see the improvement that has been made over the time that they've been with you, over that first year back from COVID. These assessments offer really high levels of objectivity, validity and reliability over other forms of assessment, and indeed over some of our competitors. There are some great assessments out there. I really believe ours is one of the best because of that computer adaptive nature of it. We've got 30 years experience. This is actually the same assessment that we originally designed in the 1980s and has been complemented and tweaked, but we haven't been able to actually improve it by adding different items in. It is the best indicator we can get of student aptitudes and skills. One of the important things about this type of assessment is that it can reduce the natural biases that occur when humans assess other humans. So we know that as educators, you are absolutely brilliant at understanding what your students know and be able to rank them within the class, be able to know who are the most able, who are the least able. But when it comes to making comparisons outside your classroom, thinking about the potential of those students when compared to other students outside the classroom, that's a lot harder, and natural biases can creep in there. And an assessment like we have prevents that from happening, or certainly limits that. So a baseline assessment can help you look into the future. So set ambitious but realistic goals. Even in these situations, we take a baseline score and we link it to the likelihood of students getting every single IGCSE grade, for example, or every IB diploma grade. So I might assess Emma. She would get a baseline score, which is linked to students with this baseline score usually have a 24% chance of getting a level 9. They might have a 28% chance of getting a level 8. And that way you can build up a picture of what the likely outcomes are for Emma. And I'll show you some examples of those reports in a moment. Once you set those realistic but ambitious goals, because we know, of course, ambition is one of the most important things in all the kind of the most successful education systems. It's about being ambitious. So we've set those goals, and that continues as you go through schooling with those, go through teaching and learning with those students. It sets a beacon, it lights a beacon on the horizon, this is what this student is capable of achieving, and it keeps them on track. It allows them to see what it looks like for them and steers them towards that great outcome. And it helps you as educators understand the core competencies that you have for individuals and for your classroom as a whole. And as senior leader, it gives you an understanding of what the range of outcomes might be across the whole school. And that's really important for evaluation and for understanding how effective your school is. And for an individual level, it helps in supporting to build a personalised developmental pathway that gets those students on track and gets them the best outcomes. Once we get to the outcomes, so once we've gathered IGCSE data, IB data on those students, we're able to reflect back on how successful we were. So evaluate the impact that your school had on individual students and on the cohort as a whole. Did those learners, departments, schools achieve the goals that they set out to do? And improve that this information that we provide to you is absolutely confidential to your school. So if it throws up things that you aren't really happy with, that's okay. That's information that you've got so that you know how to improve. Nobody else is going to see that. This is a professional tool to help you improve. It will help you understand the changing demographic of your students as well. So our customers who've been with us for a number of years will have what we call historical intake profiles, which show them what the intake ability levels of their cohorts are over time. So they'll be in a really great position to be able to look at how that intake profile changes in this COVID year. They likely will see some trends over time. Schools may see their intake change as maybe new large factories or industries open in a country or in a city that changes the demographic of the students who are coming to them and may impact on the ability. And of course, we know that the intake ability profile is going to impact on the results that you're likely to get later on. So that has a lot of information that's really useful for senior leadership to understand what to expect in outcomes for the school later on. Okay, so I'm just going to have a break from lecturing you and ask you another question. What data are you thinking you're going to be using to understand the level of lost learning in your classrooms? So what data are you going to use? Can you share that with us so that we can perhaps build that into the questions later on? So how confident are you that you will be able to get a good understanding of the level of lost learning over the COVID period? Okay, we've talked about the assessment. That was how you gather the data. Now we're going to talk about how you can analyse that data to get a better understanding of where you are and what you've got to deal with for the coming months. So we can look at the data to compare performance with previous cohorts. Like I just mentioned there, current CEM customers can look back at historical intake profiles and compare that with previous years. You need to be able to compare performance against national and international benchmarks. Is it possible for you to identify from those comparisons how much impact your school has had from COVID compared to other schools or other countries perhaps? Identify those most at risk. So we're going to look at who are the most disadvantaged learners. They're more likely to be heavily impacted. Those who've been disengaged over lockdown, those with lower scores. And then we're going to consider the impact on outcomes. So I'm going to now show you some example reports from our assessment, which I'm recommending that our current customers might be able to use to help them understand. And if you're new and you don't currently have something in place and you're considering using something like CEM assessment, this might help you get an idea of what you can expect. So comparing performance with previous cohorts, this report shows here, these are box and whisker plots. This is the line through the middle of the box is the average for the cohort. And if you can see the key down the right hand side there says these students who appear here on the box and whisker are well above average. These who appear down here are lower than average. So each box and whisker represents the spread of scores across the class. So the top whisker, top of the whisker, will be the most able student in your classroom, and the one on the bottom of the whisker will be the least able student in your classroom. So this here is a box and whisker every year looking at intake. Here, 2020, we can see there was a little drop in the overall level of ability for this cohort. This is 2020, so this is what we'll be likely to see when we assess in September, perhaps October. We would probably be expecting to see a drop here, and that you could interpret as being the size of the impact. You can see that there are variations each year, and I suppose what we're looking for here is, are we going to see a big drop? Are we going to see a more moderate drop? We just don't know actually until students get in, do we? By the way, once students do get back to school and we start gathering data, we're going to be telling you more about what we understand the impact to be among our customers. So comparing with previous cohorts, now we're going to look at comparing performance against benchmarks. So for an international school, what you might want to look at is you've assessed the students, you've got an overall ability score for them. We use standardized scores so that the average student will have a score of 100, the least able students around 60, 70, and the highest students about 150. So we would expect the majority of students to be around 100. In this case, the yellow bars are your school. Let's presume your school's done the assessment here. 29% of your students were scoring around 110, above average. 43% of them around 120. This is a really high performing cohort, a high ability cohort. When you compare it to the distribution of scores for other international schools, your students are of a higher ability overall than the average international school, and the same when you compare it to English state schools. So you know you've got a cohort of students here who are generally of a higher ability. But of course, we know that international schools are not all the same. So we have all sorts of different flavours of international school. So here's a report that you can use to compare your school against other international schools who may share similar characteristics. Here's you. About 120 is your average standardised score for the intake ability. Compared to international schools, you're higher. Compared to other schools who are using chem assessment in China, you're also doing better. Compared to other schools in similar membership organisations like British schools in the Middle East, like for BCEA schools, like ECIS schools, you're also performing, your intake ability is higher than other schools in that organisation. And then other schools following a similar curriculum. Your school also, in this case, appears to be performing at a better level than all other schools taking the A-level qualifications. So we've had a look at cohort performance. Now we can look at individual student performance. So here is a student who struggled over lockdown, I would suggest. Their vocabulary is low, their mathematics is a little bit less impacted, their non-verbal and their skills are also low. The dotted red line is the average level of ability we would expect for a student at this age. It looks like they are at risk. We need to get those vocabulary scores improved. We need to get their maths improved. In many cases, as they get back into school and start talking with their teachers again, with their colleagues again, starting to access the curriculum more, those things will naturally rise. And we would expect to see, if the student's assessed again in a year's time, that will have corrected. And of course, current customers would need to compare that ability profile to previous years and see what the changes are for that student. If you are a current chem customer and you've baselined your students in previous years, we strongly recommend that you baseline again this year. Normally, if you would assess your students once over a period of study, so you might assess them in year 7, get your predictions for IGCSE, and then you might not baseline them again until they go back to school, until the next cohort comes through. So you might never baseline that cohort again. We strongly recommend that in these circumstances, re-baseline them. You're going to see a drop in that level, and you're going to be able to compare it to previous profiles, and that will give you some really useful information. You can look at those most at risk by looking at a table of scores. Every student appears on here. We have an overall score for them, a vocabulary score, math score. You can rank it in order of ability. You can identify those who are the most able, those who are the least able. That will give you an idea of the groupings of students at particular levels. This is an example report from one of our primary assessments. Again, that box and whisker shows the distribution of scores. These are the scores down the right, the age-related scores down the left-hand side, the actual student's biological age along the bottom. And what we're seeing is that for, let's say, this is a year 6 cohort in the grey. There's a whole distribution of students there. Some of those students have these two at the bottom, the 2 grey students at the bottom of that box and whisker. They are really struggling. Their level of ability at this stage is actually equal to some of the lower ability students 4 or 5 years behind them. And then we've got a cluster here right at the top of that grey box and whisker, a cluster of students there who are really able for their year group. What can you do to support those really able students and make sure that they are effectively challenged and don't coast? What can you do for these students at the bottom of the ability spectrum? How can you support them to improve and do the best that they can? This we've pulled together specifically for this situation to help you identify the students who may be most in need of your support. So if you think back, this is an adaptation of the one I showed earlier, which is about the impact on the system of COVID. This is something that you could try using in your classrooms. So think about the ones with the lowest baseline score and the highest baseline score. Think about those that have been least engaged and most engaged. The ones with the lower baseline score and lower levels of engagement, they are going to be your highest risk students. They are the ones where you're going to need to get some interventions into place really quickly. Those who have got a low baseline score but have been engaged, they're at risk, but not so much so, because they're engaged students, they will get back into the rhythm very quickly. Those who've got a higher baseline score but haven't been engaged, you want to make sure you re-engage them really quickly. They're able, but you don't want to see them becoming disengaged and their scores dropping. And of course, the ones who have a high score and are engaged are your lowest risk students. So where you've got limited resources, where you've got limited time, you know where to focus your effort. So how does the baseline score that we give you from CEM, what can that tell you about potential outcomes for students? If we baseline students today and make predictions of what the likely outcomes are for them in 5 years' time, I would imagine we would get a different result to if we were to do that next year. So I think it's really important to understand that. So if you assess now, you can look at the potential grades they're going to get if all remains the same. If we don't get students back on track, if they stay now with the level of lost learning they are going to have, those are the grades they're likely to get. If you reassess in a year's time, you will see, I am confident, improved grade predictions for those students. So this is an example of a report that for a single student, it gives them the likelihood of achieving which grade for every available subject. If you assess a student now who's 12, we don't actually know. They won't have made any choices about what they're going to do in their IGCSEs or IB courses, but this will give them an idea of which of those, which subjects are going to be the easiest for them to do well in, given their baseline score. So each student will get a different set of predicted grades, predicted grade outcomes here. So it may be that a student wants to do further maths. It looks like it might be a real challenge for them. If they chose to do history, it might be easier. That shouldn't mean that they don't choose the subjects that are the most challenging, but at least it helps them understand the amount of work they might have to put in to get those subjects, to get those qualifications that they really want. As a school, this is an example from a real school. The GCSE predictions here, this is what we're looking at. So what we're looking at is now, if you run an assessment with your students, you'd get a chart like this, which says across the whole cohort in maths, you are likely to get 37% of those students achieving an A star. You're likely to get 27% of these students achieving an A. If you reassess now, in the post-COVID situation, you're likely to see a change in those predicted grade outcomes. You're likely to see a drop as those basic skills have been eroded. The difference between the one situation last year and this year, you could interpret that as the impact of COVID. If you assess again next year, you'd be likely to see, you'd hope to see, those predicted distribution of predicted grades go back to where they were pre-COVID. Okay, I've given you a look at some of those reports that we have available for you, and now we're going to run a quick poll. So we would like you, I think you'll get a poll appear. I think, Emma, can you talk us through the poll, how the poll works?
Yep, so I've just launched the poll. You will get a poll asking how prepared you feel for supporting students to recover lost learning. So you've got a couple of options there. So it'd be really good if you could answer, and then towards the end we'll share the poll so we can see the results. So I'll just leave it open for another minute or two.
I'll give you a couple of seconds just to look at that poll and pop your answer in while I top up my fluid levels. It's quite hard work. You know, it's a long time since I've talked this continuously, certainly since before lockdown. So I'm just going to have a bit of water. Great. Okay.
So I'm going to close the poll now because we've got quite a lot of answers. So thank you very much to everybody that's participated.
Okay. So we have assessed, we've analysed, and now we need to act. So we need to set goals. We need to probably reset those goals. So goals that we had for students last year, they're going to be slightly different this year. They're going to be getting the practice back in to build up those basic skills, a return to developing their vocabulary, reading better, comprehending better, writing better. And I would imagine your goals, if you're teaching in a secondary school, are not going to be let's cram as much of the curriculum in as we can before they do their exams. Your goals are most likely going to be let's focus on what's really important for each student. What do they need to know most to be able to be successful in passing those exams? Get some plans in place to support individuals and groups of learners. And then where possible, you want to reassess. And so our assessments can be done every year. We would strongly recommend that if you've assessed this year, you reassess next year. If you've assessed last year and you normally wouldn't this year, reassess this year. It'll give you a lot more information to work on. It will also really importantly give you a good understanding of how well your students have recovered. As Cambridge, as a part of Cambridge, the bigger Cambridge family, we have the advantage of having access to loads of great information on how Cambridge can support you when you go back to school. There's a web link there. You'll get the presentation shared later on, I believe. If you go to our web page, landing page there, it will take you to a portal that opens up all of the available resources that we have for existing Cambridge schools, but also other schools to help you in this moment. We also have some useful information built into some of our assessments. So for primary, people doing our primary assessment, we can give you some support with helping your students improve their maths and reading skills. We have specific interventions, exercises, resources for low attaining learners, for learners who are able but are under attaining, and for learners with motivational problems. So for students who perhaps have been a bit disaffected, disengaged, there might be some useful strategies there for you. So some of those strategies include some really great work that we did on peer tutoring. So I don't know if any of you have used peer tutoring in the past, but we did a randomized controlled trial on the effectiveness of having children teach other children, and I'll give you a quick, a free nugget of information that our customers would normally only get, is that the most effective pairing for peer tutoring is for the tutor to be 2 years ahead of the tutee. The most impact you get, so you get the most impact of that learning in just basic maths and reading, and the greatest impact is on the tutor, not the tutee. Both of them gain both of them will see, I think it's something like up to 3 months additional learning gains from being part of peer tutoring, but the tutor gets the most impact. So that's one strategy that's included in there. There's another on the importance of memory and how memory can improve mathematics outcomes. And then there's some strategies there on how to identify and remediate dyscalculia. Okay, so let's just think back to what we've talked about today. It's 3 steps: assess, assess now, assess as soon as students get back into school. Analyse that data. Don't just analyse it as you normally would. Try and compare it to previous year's data. Think about the impact it might have on later outcomes. Think about who's the most disengaged, the most disaffected, and think about those that are scoring, have got low scores in this moment in time. And then act as soon as you can. Get those lesson plans, personalised developmental pathways in place. Take advantage of the resources that are available to you. We have some for our customers. Our colleagues in Cambridge University Press and our colleagues in Cambridge Assessment have some free resources out there that are available for you to use. If you have a system like this in place where you have regular, high quality, highly valid, reliable and robust assessments in place, you will be better prepared, more resilient and more able to adapt to situations like this that might, God forbid, occur in the future. And I'm going to hand over to Emma to take any questions, field any questions for us.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was really insightful. So we've had quite a lot of questions come through, but I thought I would pick up first on the question we asked earlier, which is what data people might have been using, if any. And there's been a real mix. So we've had data from formative assessments, can be one method of assessing students. Another person commented that they've been using continuous assessment because it helps to know where a student is, where a student is going, where the student will be at a specified time. Other people have said things like, well, yes, we can give assignments and try and assess those assignments, but not everybody's engaging with those assignments, and therefore it's difficult to have an idea where somebody might be in the curriculum or against curriculum objectives, for example. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that.
Yeah, I would just comment that I think things like continuous assessment, things like looking at data that they've submitted, work that they've submitted, is a really, really important part of the picture. I think, but as one of the delegates has obviously mentioned, getting in this moment in time, the level of engagement, the level of return is going to be challenging, and you're going to see work coming from the students who are the most engaged. So what about the ones that haven't been? And so something like this, I think you'll find is quite engaging for the student. Our assessment is quite engaging for the student. They're quite fun to do. They don't feel like a test. They feel more like a kind of a puzzle or a set of games that they can do, particularly the primary ones. And once students are back in, they do stay engaged on a computer delivered assessment. It's quick, it's adaptive. Because it's adaptive, you don't get a lot of questions that are either too hard for you, which make you feel kind of disengaged, or too easy for you, which means that you're bored, and by the time you get to the questions that are right for you, you've kind of switched off a bit. So it's a great way of getting a good measure for everybody. Now, if we find at school that school returns, but actually we can't get into classrooms, we do have options for home assessment. So if you're worried about this being a continuing situation where you're worrying about students at home and how much that learning they've lost, we can support you with that if you approach us. It's not a standard offer, but we can do that for you. Sorry, Emma, that was a long response.
No, very thorough response. Great, thank you very much. We also asked people as well what was going on in their situation and their experience. We had some comments. So one from Jordan, for example, saying there's been significant disengagement, particularly with the year 10 to 13 students, and that was kind of emphasised further by parents not really engaging either. You know, the government not necessarily taking decisions that would have made a lot of sense when it came to alternative certification processes that might have been available, etc. Confusion around Ministry of Education, and there's quite a lot of that in the comments as well, in terms of confusion from ministries, etc., etc. I think that's just as much part of the UK response as well.
I think it's just worth mentioning there that for students of that age group who may be disengaged, it's worth reminding them about those outcomes that are there available to them. So even now they might be thinking, well, they're GCSEs, IGCSEs, A levels, they're a year off, they don't really need to worry about it. But one of the reports that we produce gives, for an individual student, it gives you one of those little bar graphs that I showed, where what it does is it says, these are all the available grades to you for, let's say, your English IGCSE. Students who did this well, who got this baseline score in this assessment, the majority of them went on to get a 7. Students who worked really hard with the same baseline score as you went on to get a level 8, and actually some of them went on to get a level 9. So what that does is it kind of focuses their eyes on the prize. If they know that they want to go to a particular university, or they want to get a particular job or follow a certain career, then just show them what the future looks like for them and the range of possible outcomes. If they do really well, they could get a level 9 based on this score, on this baseline score they've got. If they don't re-engage quickly, they could end up getting a really low grade. That does happen, and it shows all of that data that we show in those reports. They're based on what has really happened to students in the past. So it might help. I know they have to be interested and engaged in those exams as well, and maybe they're not, and that's a whole different matter. But if they're just engaged at the moment and are thinking, oh, my exam's age is off, I don't need to worry about it. If you do our assessment and use one of those graphs to have a hard conversation with those students, think about what's going to happen to you in 2 years' time. Is this where you want to be? If you don't work, this is where you might be.
Thanks, Kate. We also had someone that said that their experience is really good so far in teaching higher grades, so grades 5, 6 onwards, but in teaching lower primary grades, it's not been as positive. So the question there was, how do we handle non-serious students of lower primary, where you might not be able to give them that kind of ultimatum about, is this where you want to be in 2 years' time?
Yeah, I guess that's about making it interesting for them, isn't it? And the nice thing about delivering a curriculum at that age is that there are lots of ways of bringing it to life and making it more interesting. I also think that the rate of recovery for the younger students is likely to be greater than the rate of recovery for the older students. So those of you who've studied psychology will know that the brain is incredibly plastic when you're younger, and it gets less so as you get older. It's more malleable. So the rate that children learn when they're younger is a lot higher than the rate they learn as they get older. So you might take in more facts when you're older, 16, 17, 18, but all of those basic skills that you need to access those subjects later on are growing apace when you're young. I think it's up to the age of 7, you would expect to see a lot of malleability in the brain. They will recover a lot more quickly. So I think that you shouldn't be too worried about that. And of course, when school goes back, children love to be back in with their friends and back in the classroom and with all the play equipment. So I think once we're in a situation to get them back into the classroom, they'll recover quickly.
Thanks, Kate. We had another comment that was just suggesting that, online learning is fine, but a lot of students avoid submitting the homework, so then it becomes difficult to assess, etc., etc. And I think that's quite common that we've seen. So one of the questions there was, what strategies can a teacher use to overcome this attitude of learner at IGCSE, AS or A level in terms of not being able to submit homework so you can do that assessment during this period of online learning?
Yeah, I think that's a real challenge, and to be honest, I don't have all of those answers. I think if you when you get the presentation sent through to you, visit the Cambridge sites. There's lots of really useful information in there. I think I would probably go back to the reminding them about the prize that's there for them. They've got their exams coming up soon. It's not that far away. If you get, if you can baseline them, get a baseline score for them and show them what's possible. In many cases, they haven't really thought what's possible for them. So, one of those charts that I showed gave them the range of that gives you every GCSE subject, IGCSE subject, and the chance of them getting whatever grade. And it may be that going through something like that with them would open up thoughts with them about what they might like to do with themselves in the future. Students with that particular baseline score went on to do really well in physics and in maths. What careers are there that you can get with physics and maths? I think it's really hard, and I'm just talking off the top of my head here. I'm not in the classroom. I don't see what you see, but I think that the data that we can give can help students and teachers understand what what great things there are in a student's future. Linking those qualifications, maths, physics, to all of the careers that are available to you if you have those qualifications, that can be quite motivating. A lot of our schools, certainly our UK independent schools, will use that information to set ambition, to get the students thinking about their futures, and to really focus on the prize that's ahead of them.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think you answered the next question a little bit in the presentation, but it might be quite good to emphasise it. So the question was, can the baseline assessments be used by the schools to assess students on an individual level, or is it just for a group of students? And can they be accessed at any time?
Yes, you can use the assessment with as many or as few students as you choose. It's more powerful the more students that you assess in your school, because then you can make those comparisons between students. You can get a better understanding of how a student compares to others in the classroom. If you only assess one student, you do get some useful information, but what you don't get is to understand how they, where they sit in the broader population. Is it just a strategy that you would put in place just for them, or are there other students who could benefit from the same strategy? And absolutely, you can use our assessment at any time of year. My recommendation would be assess as soon as you can when students get back in. And if you're not getting back into school as normal, I know if some of you are in India, some of those countries, you're still experiencing school closures and you might not be going back until September, October. It's up to you. You could choose to do it then, September, October, when everybody's back in the classroom. If you're really concerned, you could choose to do it maybe September time and use the offer of home assessment. I would limit that probably. I think if you can wait until students get back in, I think that's going to be the best time to do it, because that's when you're going to really start improving things. And then when you baseline them a year later, you'll be able to see that improvement. If you baseline now, you'll understand the situation, but still be a little bit, it will be a bit difficult to improve on that situation while students continue to be at home. And the ones who need most of your help, those disengaged students, will continue to be disengaged.
Thank you, Kate. We had another question as well, asking if baseline assessment can be used for schools in India. So, for example, with their curriculum there,
Absolutely.
the CBSE. Yeah.
Okay, yes, CBSE. So we don't currently predict to CBSE grades, but students can still sit the assessment. So you would still be able to get comparisons of ability with other students in the group, and with ability levels of a national and international population. But we don't currently we predict to GCSE, IGCSE and O level. We're looking at considering whether to include CBSE in the future.
Okay, thank you. Just a really interesting comment here as well I wanted to pick up on, which was one of the challenges we faced in our primary school is to educate parents more than the children on the importance of remote learning, which I think is really interesting. And I think, you know, in the past, I've also seen that children often are quite willing just to accept the remote learning, quite happy to engage, but it's getting the parents to really understand the importance and the viability of it as well. So that's a really interesting, really interesting comment, I thought. So we've got a couple, I think still quite a few questions, but we want to also cover the poll and our follow-up as well. So I'm just going to choose one more question for you to answer. So this one is: if students have been using the starter mover from Cambridge English, how different is the CEM indication that it would differ in terms of their literacy?
Okay, so I have to confess I am not totally familiar with that product from one of the other parts of Cambridge. I think, but what I can tell you is what's unique about our assessment. So we're not assessing English language. We are assessing, well, we are. So it's English medium, and we're assessing English language vocabulary, and we're assessing mathematics. So what we're assessing are skills and aptitudes that research tells us are really important for later learning across the whole curriculum. So we know that students who do really well in our assessment will also do really well in their examinations, and the ones who struggle are going to be the ones who get the lower grades in their outcomes. So I'm taking an example from our primary assessment here. For our assessment for little children, age 4, one of the things we measure in there is phonological awareness. And again, those psychologists among you will know that phonological awareness is a really important precursor for learning to read. And so that's just one example where the things that we choose to assess aren't related necessarily to what's being taught in the curriculum, although some things will be taught in the curriculum. What we're measuring are concepts or skills that researchers told us are really important for later development. So one of those things happens to be vocabulary. So the better a student's vocabulary, the better they're going to be at reading. And actually, it's also one of the best indicators of maths ability if you've got high vocabulary, I guess, because it's about part of developing your vocabulary is about parental engagement, how much you've been read to, and it is linked to socioeconomic status. So sorry, that's a bit of a rambling answer. I don't know the specifics on that product, but what I do know is that our assessment is really unique. It's not unique, but it's a really powerful way of assessing a very specific subset of skills that we know are very important for later success across every curriculum subject.
Thank you so much, Kate. We saw loads of questions, but we don't have time, unfortunately. So what I would like to do, if that's okay with you, Kate, is we'll take those questions after today's webinar and the one we're doing later on today, and we'll put them together in some sort of FAQ or wiki and give you access to those as well, because there are so many really interesting comments and questions. I just want to share the poll results here. So you can see here that 13% of respondents felt very prepared for supporting students to recover lost learning, 9% underprepared, and then the majority, 76%, felt somewhat prepared. So it feels like there's some guidance from government, some guidance from schools potentially, some teachers have managed to find stuff themselves, but there's still a way to go to get to the point where we feel completely prepared for what's coming up. Okay. So I'll hand back to you.
Yeah, thank you everybody for listening, especially, as Emma mentioned, those of you who I'm sure are already on your break and should be taking a well-earned rest. So I hope it's been worth your time spending an hour with us today. It's been really great to talk to you, and some of those questions are really useful. They're useful for us to understand what you as educators are experiencing, and I'm sure it's reassuring for you to see that others are experiencing the same things as you. If you want to find out more about us, about CEM, there's a web link there. There's also a phone number that you can contact. And the last thing I like to say is that at the end of the presentation, I've just listed some sources that I've used to pull together information for this presentation. There's something there from the Education Endowment Foundation in the UK that you might find helpful on why you would use baseline assessment. There's the OECD latest June report on the impact of school closures and how that's being impacted around the world and what world governments are doing. And then there's a link to John Hattie's paper on what matters when schools are closed. Thank you very much, everybody, for talking to us, for listening to us today. It's been a pleasure to spend some time with you, and I hope you go on to enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone, and we'll send a follow-up. So you should get your certificate and also a follow-up to this session about an hour after we stop recording. We'll also follow up with where you can get the answers to all those questions that we didn't have time to go through today as well. So thank you very, very much. We really appreciate your time. Have a good rest of the day. Thank you. Bye-bye.